Put it down. It glows when it's scared.
How would you know? He's mine.
Just because you caught it and put it in a jar doesn't mean it belongs to you.
It's not it, it's Henry. Henry lives here now. Don't you, Henry?
That's new. May I be excused?
You haven't touched your meal.
Food you can eat without teeth. My favorite.
Sometimes I miss Dad's cooking. Sorry, Mum.
Sometimes I do too. I've washed your uniforms for Monday. Excited? How are you feeling, Mol?
It's like you said. There's no changing it. Can I please go now?
Just eat.
I don't feel well.
Cramps?
Gross. No, I want to be alone.
Oh, that's new for you.
Oh, shut up, Till, you moron.
Molly,
What?
don't speak to her like that.
Sorry.
Don't speak to me like that either.
Oh, what, Mum?
Do you have any manners?
Do you even like me? Do you? Do you?
I'm your mother, Molly. I'm not your friend. It doesn't matter if I like you.
Power surge detected.
Is that Henry?
System's back online.
Hi folks! We've updated the medieval game environment by Quixel Megascans to Unreal Engine 5, using new-gen features such as Nanite and Lumen. Download it now on the Unreal Engine Marketplace or from your launcher. Find out more at unrealengine.com/feed. While you're there, go behind the scenes on Blue Dot and how MetaHuman Animator unlocks the ability for teams to create cinematics of stunning fidelity and resonance by using a creative on-set process typical of traditional filmmaking to direct and capture a performance. In a recent developer interview, we caught up with Kabam to get their creation story for King Arthur Legends Rise, a reimagination of the Arthurian legends as a cinematic turn-based RPG, and how Unreal Engine 5 helped them to launch cross-play experiences on PC and mobile. Helter Studio created an action experience with huge, beautiful open worlds and online cross-platform multiplayer using Unreal Engine in its debut game, Tower of Fantasy. Learn more about their creative and technical workflow and some tips from the studio on the feed. Did you enter the 2023 Epic Mega Jam? We would love for you to share your projects with us and the community on the Epic Developer Community at dev.epicgames.com/community, which is also the best place to post if you want to be featured. Moving over to this week's Community Spotlights. Director Vincent Tujas and actress Bess Davies have captured the essence of emotion in storytelling at its finest in their teaser trailer of Capture, a story of megalomania and loneliness of entrepreneurs. Follow the short film's progress on the forums. MetaHuman Animator has many fantastic tools to bring your work to life, as seen by 3D filmmaker Daniel Magyar's leveraging of the tools in their monolithic work titled Study of a Neanderthal-like Man. Let them know what you think on the forums. Our last spotlight of the week comes courtesy of environment artist Kristen Jelly. The River is a beautiful and photorealistic scene that flows creativity, utilizing lumen, nanite, and the creator's LUT for color depth. Dive in on the forums. Thanks for watching this week's news and Community Spotlight.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Inside Unreal, a weekly show where we learn, explore, and celebrate everything Unreal. I'm your host Tina, and today with me I have Erin, who might be familiar to some of you. We've had you on quite a few times, so I appreciate you coming on to talk about all the different topics and project samples and stuff. I know today specifically we've brought you back to talk about the Cropout project sample once more. The first time, in case anybody missed it, we had Erin on, as well as some of the other lovely artists who worked on the project come on to chat about just the project as a whole and some really cool bits and bobs that you could learn and pull from there yourselves. But today we're revisiting the sample project to specifically talk about the mobile components of it and how you can kind of take bits and pieces from that project to incorporate them into your own mobile projects that you may be making and have questions about. So Erin, for anyone here who might not know you, do you mind telling them just a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. So yeah, I'm Aaron Langmead. I'm a senior technical artist here at Epic. For those of you who've seen my previous streams, you've probably noticed I've changed job title, I think almost every single time I've done the live stream. So I tend to scoot around Epic quite a bit, doing lots of different bits and bobs. So my main thing that generally hasn't changed is that I build stuff in the engine and then show people the stuff that I've built and how I built it. So I have a really awesome job. I just get to make cool stuff in the engine all day and then do little presentations and little videos and stuff like that, showing people how I did it all.
Yes, which we appreciate because it's always incredible stuff that is super helpful. So thank you for being around as the local builder of all things cool and awesome. So if you don't mind, for anyone who might be watching that isn't familiar with what the Cropout sample project is, do you mind just kind of giving them a sort of general rundown of what that is in general as well?
Yeah. So Cropout is it's our latest sample game. I've got it open here in my screen. I'm trying not to shake the mouse around too much. And basically, it's a little, very casual kind of top-down RTS game. So you've got, kind of like generic like mouse and keyboard movement, but you can also use gamepad, and then it also works with touch as well. So we've got some little villagers, and we can command them to go and do stuff like farm, chop down trees for wood, and gather other resources. And then there's a little build menu where you can build different things, and your goal is to basically build the monument, right? So it's a super casual, very simple demo that aims to show people how you could go about building your own type of top-down RTS, or you could use it as a base to build your own thing, from as well. So that's basically it, right? And it came from a desire to have a bit more kind of like broader content, because kind of one of the things that we know is that you can use the engine to build pretty much whatever you want. You're not limited by that, but we show off a lot of stuff that's very, very high end, very super realistic, especially with like the release of Nanite and Lumen that make that stuff look so incredible, right? But just because that stuff is there doesn't mean you can't use it for other art styles, for other target platforms. So the big kind of like focus of this was like, let's show people how you can go about building a cross-platform game. So something that can work on any platform, whether it's the PlayStation 5 or whether it's like a, you know, kind of Android handheld device or the Switch or a PC or whatever. So it's kind of very much been designed as kind of like something that scales up and down depending on the platform that you release onto, and yeah, can kind of work with any input method.
That's awesome. It is such an incredible project. So if anyone hasn't gotten their hands on it already, we've posted the link for it in the chat here, so you can go check it out, download it, play around. There's so much incredible stuff in there that's just helpful in general. But yeah, make sure you check that out. It's a really good one. But today, we're going to be focusing more specifically on kind of the more mobile optimization aspects of the project, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of those things where we built Cropout to be cross-platform specific. So there's a few decisions that we've made that are aiming to kind of like show it working across all the platforms. So I'll talk about, you know, kind of how we might have done things differently if we were building it specifically for mobile and mobile only. And then, but a lot of it is still very applicable, right? So a lot of the stuff that we set up is stuff that you would just set up normally for a mobile device, regardless of whether you were doing it for cross-platform or not.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm personally very excited to learn more about kind of how to tackle those, because I know it's a topic that doesn't get discussed too much as far as Unreal Engine goes. I feel like we're more commonly known for big, huge, multi-million polygon, hyper-realistic, you know, crazy stuff like that. So I think it'll be really interesting to kind of dive into some of the more about optimization and getting things to work across these smaller platforms, or even like low spec tech and things like that. It'll be really an interesting topic to kind of dive into.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you've also got to be careful not to just get drawn into watching the game run, because if you're not careful, you will just watch those little characters just like getting on with their day and just like farming away. So I'll turn that off actually, because otherwise I'm just gonna spend the entire time just staring at them working.
It's the hats for me. How can you not watch them just like bob around and
more wibbly wobbly hats? You've got to do it. And you know what, we'll be going into those hats in more detail, because there's some optimization tricks with those hats as well. So yeah, it works really well. Okay, cool. Well, shall I get started on and just pick a topic and we'll dive into it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay. So there's lots and lots of different ways that you can optimize your game. And Unreal has very much been designed and built around you creating a single project that you distribute to all the different platforms that you intend to distribute to, right? So the idea is that you only want to have a single source for your actual game project, but that single source can output to the lowest end Android device all the way up to the highest end PC, super crazy, massive spec, right? So with that in mind, there's a lot of stuff that is just settings that you can go through and you can just apply, and you can do, you know, kind of whatever you would just apply it, and then based on the platform that you release it onto, it will just throw it out, you know, kind of at that particular setting. So we've got loads of these little settings all over the engine. And one place that we have those is on our meshes. So if we go into our environment and our meshes, and we open up one of these, let's say this background fog mesh, which is just a little kind of background fog cylinder. If we scroll down, we have all of our LOD settings that we have for our platform. And you'll notice that we've got a little kind of grayed out section here. And actually, this is not a good example asset because I haven't generated LODs. I have generated LODs on this one. So we can have a look at this one. So for this, we have a load of little plus buttons. And generally this is the same for all, like kind of throughout the engine. Whenever you see this small plus icon with a little circle around it, that generally means that it's a setting that you can apply per platform. So when you click on it, you'll get all of the different platforms that are available for your particular build of the editor. So if you've added more platforms, you'll see more platforms here. So if you've added Switch or PlayStation or whatever, then that will be visible on this as well. So we have a generic thing called a platform group, which is kind of like the container for specific platform types. So mobile is a very good example. And inside that mobile container will be Android and iOS as the main ones. But then there's also larger subsections of that, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But basically what we can do is we have a thing called LODs in the editor. If you are a seasoned developer, or at least a developer who's done some time with meshes before, you'll know what a LOD is, which is basically a level of detail version of the mesh, which is simpler or more complex, and you can kind of pick and choose which one to use based on both the base platform that you're using and also the distance from the camera. So generally with LODs, it has historically been for distance. So as you get further away from an asset, it doesn't need to be as detailed anymore. So you would use a lower quality LOD. But we've also added in support for things called LOD biasing, or kind of like setting a base LOD. And what that lets you do is, if you are developing for cross-platform, you can have your super high-res, shiny, fancy mesh, which could be Nanite, for things like PS5. And then when you package it out for the Switch, you can say, well, actually, that one's a bit too much for the Switch or for Android or for iOS. I'm going to drop down the LOD to be like the base one. Now, if you are developing for mobile, then you may not need to start off with all of those super high-res meshes. Okay, so when we set this stuff up, we're generally setting that stuff up because we want to say, okay, we've got all these other platforms in mind that we need to keep in, that we need to take into account. Do we actually need to keep it? And if you're developing just for mobile, then you probably don't. You can probably just set your base model that you're building to be the mobile ready asset. But the caveat to that is that mobile has a very, very broad range of platform specs, right? So you can go all the way up to the super fancy, kind of like iPhone. I think they're on 15 now. Or kind of like some of the Galaxy devices, right? Some of them are like very high spec for phones, but if you want to target a broader range of mobile users, you often have to target quite a low spec mobile device. So with that in mind, while you wouldn't necessarily need to set anything for this particular one, we actually have a more detailed version of that inside our device profiles. So device profiles are the way of managing your distribution to different platforms. So when we open up our device profiles, you are presented with a very, very long list of all of the different kind of preset platforms that are available in the editor. And you'll notice that most of those platforms are Android and iPhone specs. So what this allows you to do is, because we can detect which platform and which device we're on when we launch the game, we can change the quality of the game based on that particular platform. So, for example, if we know that we're on an iPhone 8 or an iPhone X, we can have a much lower scalability setting than if we were to have something like the iPhone 14 or the iPhone or the 14 Pro. And inside here, if if we open this up, we have even more settings that we can apply to these particular ones. And what's nice about this as well is that we also have an inheritance chain with this as well. So for the iPhone 14 Pro, we have the parent of the iPhone 13 Pro, and you can work your way all the way back until you reach the base platform, which would be iOS. Same for Android as well. We have a load of different Android devices, but then right at the top we have Android, and we also have, which is quite useful, an Android low, mid, and high. Now, when I am working, I tend to just stick to low, medium, and high granularity, because like managing every single like kind of tiny system variance for each of these can be very, very time consuming. So I tend, when I'm working on the mobile side of things, I tend just to stick with low, medium, and high, and that's absolutely fine, right? And because it's inheritance based, if we change any of these, any of the ones that inherit from this, will automatically pick up those additional changes that we've set. So we can do that for all sorts of things. So we can do that for our static meshes. We can also do that for textures. You can set that for your particle effects. You can set it for like an absolute ton of stuff. Another really good one is landscape grass, which is a way of using the GPU to render a very high density volume of meshes on the landscape. We don't need it in this because we don't actually have a landscape for it, but I can show you anyway. So if we add a new landscape grass type, add the plus button, you can see that we get our little plus buttons here, and each of these allow us to specify a set per platform. So if you're building like an open world game with a nice big landscape and you've got landscape grass, doesn't have to be grass, but it does need to not need collision, which is why grass is often a good descriptor for it. But if you're using, kind of this particular one, you can say, hey, I want my base one to be 1,000 in density, but for mobile, I just want you to be like 200 and stuff like that. So this stuff works really, really nicely for being able to kind of like scale stuff up and down. And one of the other things you can do as well with that is that you can actually expose other platform settings to this drop down. So if you want, let's say, the Android high, medium, and low, and maybe the iOS versions as well, if you wanted those in there, then you can actually expose those to this drop down and say, well, actually, I want those platforms in there. And again, if you're doing mobile development, then it's well worth taking the time to add those in, because actually, you're kind of scaling on a different level, right? If you're not taking into account those super high-end platforms, you want those, they just focusing on the mobile side of things. And that way you can set your density in this example, for your low, medium, and high. You can even just set it to 0. The same goes with meshes as well. So on any mesh or asset that we have in our scene, so this is on our actors, not necessarily just meshes, we can specify a quality level that we use this asset at. So if we go down, I think it's in LOD, we have a detail mode. You can basically specify whether it will be rendered or not based on the quality setting that you set it to. So you can have like a low, medium, and high that you're using for just your mobile devices, and that would allow you to cull a load of actors that you don't need in your scene, especially if you've got a load of kind of like decorators. So really good example of this is if you are, you've got like a mossy rock, right? And on your mossy rock, you've got a load of like little cards that just add some extra detail to it. But you can't afford that on your lower end platform because it's just an expense that you just can't afford. So for that little kind of mossy overlay that you put on it, you can just set the detail mode on that asset so that it's high only, and that way it just won't get used. Now, for a lot of this stuff, if you set your platform settings for it, and again, this one's more for kind of cross-platform, not necessarily mobile, but it would work across iOS and Android, which is a little bit confusing. But basically, you can actually strip out content completely based on the platform that you're releasing onto. So it all kind of depends on where it goes in the package. If you have a single package and you need that scalability, then it will have everything that it needs to transition between each of those scalability settings. So for Android, let's say high, medium, and low. If you do, kind of like you've got different quality settings for each of those, and you export out a package for Android, it will contain everything it needs for that. Whereas if you have some stuff that's, let's say, for Switch or for iOS, you want to have a higher standard of quality for your assets than Android for some reason, right? In that instance, you could say, okay, well, I want a quality setting that's going to be for just those higher end ones and not for Android. And then if that quality setting is locked out in Android from the device profiles and from the profile settings that you set out, then it will actually strip that level of detail out of the build, including things like textures, right? So if you say, I've got the highest quality texture is like 1K or 2K, but my absolute maximum is 512 for that texture, then it will just strip out those top 2 levels, and you'll never see that texture cost in the final package build. So yeah, I'm just going to keep rattling through stuff until you interrupt me with some questions, and we'll see how we get on.
Please do.
The next one on that is our textures, right? So our textures have LOD biasing. So the textures, it's not technically called LODs, it's called MIPs. If you don't know what MIPs are, I think it's like Latin for multus in partem or something like that. But basically it just means that it's a smaller texture, right, as you go down. So you start off on MIP level 0, that's the biggest texture you can have. In this case, it's 2K. And then as we go down, and again, because we're using power of 2, so 2048, 1024, 512, 256, etc., we can very easily reduce down our texture size. And based on the based on the quality settings that we set up for our device, so again, that Android high, medium, low, and so on, we can basically set what the starting MIP is for that texture. Now, for this, we don't actually set it per texture. What we do is we assign a grouping for our textures. So all of our textures will go into a group, and we can make our own groups as well if you find that the grouping that's provided isn't enough. But you can group your textures up, so based on character, world, weapon, vehicle, and so on. And based on that grouping, we can set our LOD bias and our maximum texture size for each of those different areas. And this is really useful because while you may want to drop like the general world quality, you might not want to sacrifice your character's texture quality, right? So in that instance, you'd want to be able to easily say, okay, max texture size on the world is going to be 512, and then for characters, it's going to be 1024. And that way, all of your textures that are marked under the character setting will be limited to that particular setting. So that's, again, inside our device profiles. You can see from our texture LOD settings here, we have all of the different groups that we mentioned earlier. And you can go through and you can specify, this is the minimum LOD size I want to use, this is the maximum texture size that I want to use. And again, you can set it for VT as well, virtual texture. And then you can also set up a LOD bias as well, which is basically going to kind of like, again, reduce that LOD biasing down. So a really good thing you can do for this one, something I did for Cropout, was to basically set a maximum texture size that texture can be for Android and for iOS. So all you need to do is you just go in, you can specify 1024 or 512, whatever you want it to be, and that way you can very quickly and very easily lock down what those textures are. And as long as there's nothing in their inheritance chain that is requesting the higher resolution textures, it will strip out anything that's higher. So if you've bought in the textures at 8K for whatever reason, it won't package up that 8K texture unless you're saying, okay, no, actually 8K is fine for Android High or something like that, right? Or base Android. Please don't use 8K textures for your mobile games. As a general rule of thumb, you probably can't afford it and you don't need it. So yes, that's kind of how you would do it for your assets. Same is true for your particles as well. So if you open up any of your particle systems, like so, and inside our properties, we have a thing called an effect type, which again is kind of lets you bracket different effects together into set groups, except rather than us having like a load of predefined names, you actually just make the ones you need. So whenever you build one, you can go in and then you can specify your system scalability settings. So if we open this, so you can set, kind of low, medium, and high, and you can call some CVar conditions. And if you don't know what CVars are, that stands for console variable, and it allows you to kind of specify a particular, rendering restriction or rendering limitation on your platform. Again, that's also in device profiles as well. So basically, in fact, most of these, so if we click on something like directional lights and stuff like that, a lot of these CVars, a lot of these variables listed here are actually also controllable as CVars, and you can set those per platform. So if you have shadows, is a really good example of this. We have a thing called cascaded shadow maps, which is kind of a slightly older way of rendering shadows. We now have virtual shadows. If you're using cascaded shadows, you can set the dynamic shadow distance per platform. And same with the number of dynamic shadows, you can set that again per platform as well. So for your Android device, again, you can have high, medium, and low. You can set a CVar for your dynamic shadow distance for each of those specific Android devices. And the same is true for our scalability settings on our Niagara particles as well. So as well as being able to specify our CVar, we can also set max distance and things like that, which is just going to start culling those particles depending on how far away they are from the camera. So that covers our static meshes, our textures, and our particle effects, which are kind of like our key items on the on our asset list. You can also do that on your sound effects as well. You can nope, not that one. I go in and find some of the original audio cues, something like this. On our audio cue, you can specify the quality of the particular thing, so your compression, and again, a lot of the time you can specify some of that stuff on the platform as well. So that covers most of the platforms. I think that's pretty much it. One of the big things to keep in mind is that things like Nanite isn't supported by mobile yet. So you won't be able to use Nanite geometry on any of your assets, and therefore it's a good idea to not try and build your assets for Nanite if you're only doing it for mobile. If it's cross-platform and you've got Nanite involved, it's a completely different conversation. But if you are building just for mobile, there's no need to build for Nanite unless you want to be really forward-thinking about your mobile game in the future and being ready for that future when Nanite comes to mobile at some random potential time, and maybe even not, right? Like, I don't want to specify that that's going to be a thing that happens, but yeah. So for mobile, Nanite is not a thing. So at that point, you are using your LOD setups. If you haven't used Unreal before, you may not know that we actually have automatic LODs that can be generated for all of your assets. And what's really nice is that you can actually just set it up for one and then just copy and paste it across to the others, which is pretty much what I did for this. So you can, once you've got a LOD setting, you can just do it for one asset, copy the LOD, and then shift right click and then just paste the LOD, and it will just apply that setting that you set up for all of them. It's a much easier way of working, and then you can go through and have a look at them, and obviously if they're not working on some of the assets, then you can go in and you can change those independently. But it's a nice way of kind of like just very rapidly doing it yourself. So generally speaking, you do just need to make that first asset, the nice high quality but still mobile friendly asset, and then you can automatically generate your LODs just using the automatic LOD generation tools inside here. So all you need to do is specify the number of LODs. That's grayed out because I haven't changed anything, but if I were to say we want 4 LODs, we can then apply those changes. But do think about whether you need LODs at all. I would also say, because that is, when you're generating LODs, you are making new meshes each time. So you're making simpler meshes, but they are still meshes, right? So when you generate your LODs, you're making a whole new asset for each level. So if I've got 3 LODs here, then I'm making 3 assets, right? Rather than just having the one. So ideally, what you want to do, again, this very much depends on the type of game you're building, but if you're building like an open world game, for example, then LODs may not actually be necessary. You could just rely on the distance LOD, which gets automatically generated on big kind of like world partitioned levels. So you may not need a LOD at all in that instance, but it's it kind of depends on the game you're building. Yeah. So before I move on, do we have any questions?
We do. We have quite a few, actually. Some of the first ones I kind of want to... I've been collecting them just so I could throw them all at you. Mm-hmm. The main thing I want to start with is there's a couple questions about profiles specifically. One here from Fire Dragon Flint. They're wondering if there is an easy way to see which profiles have been modified.
Ooh, that's a good question. So I don't think there is a good way of seeing which ones have been modified, because these device profiles are actually going to be stored at the engine level, if I remember correctly. So whenever we make modifications to this particular device profile, it's actually going to be setting that to the default device profile setting that you've specified on your inside your engine project, right? And again, like, because Unreal is inheritance based, like everywhere, the project will inherit from the editor settings unless you specify one at the project setting. So when you are modifying these, you can modify them inside this editor, but as far as I understand, you will be editing the default editor setting for that particular device. What you're actually better off doing, I'm just going to find the right folder over here in just a second. But what you are better off doing is samples, games, Cropout. Let's see if this transferred across. But you're actually better off having a default device profiles config file that you generate inside your config folder for your project. And then what that will do is it will give you a way of defining, kind of all of your different platforms, all of the different CVars based on those platforms, and all of those rules. It's also much, much easier to copy and paste that stuff across. And obviously you don't have to do it in Notepad like a scrub like me. You could do it in like Visual Studio Code or Notepad++ or whatever your thing of choice, and then you'll get at least some nicer formatting of the structure there. But yes, you would want to do that inside your config folder here. I think you can even do it inside the default engine or default game. I can't quite remember which one, but it's all on our docs for that particular setting. So yes, you should do it. You should do it on here. Set up your profiles in here, and then what that will do is it will override any of the profiles that that your engine has, but it will kind of like copy the rest of them over, and that way as well. You don't have to have you can ignore a lot of this stuff, right? Because actually, you don't necessarily want to have it for every single profile. You can also delete a lot of those profiles as well. Like if you don't want that noise, platform noise on there, then you can get rid of them. But again, it depends on how high you want to go, right, or how complex you want to go. Because actually, if you're building a really big, complex game, like Fortnite, maybe, right, like then at that point, actually, you might want to start making those very specific tweaks per platform, and especially with something like the iPhone, which has a very, very structured system. It doesn't have any other manufacturers building stuff, right? Like there is a very clear hierarchy of that stuff. Then at that point, it does become quite useful to potentially do it for every single device. But yeah, if you are just kind of targeting like a more generic, I'm happy for everyone in this category to have this particular setting, then there's nothing wrong with just having kind of like a very, very set batched setup for your device. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one here is from Turning Cog, and they're wondering, could we control these CVars in an ini file, ini file, or is that just a PC thing?
Nope, 100%. You can control it in an ini file, and in fact, that's what you do on the device profile. So, again, I'll just use the in editor's display just because it's nice and quick to bring up. But in here, there's a section called console variables, and you can specify, kind of all of the different ones that you want for that. And in fact, we do that on our nice wobbly hats, which I think we do. Now I've got to remember where I put it. I think I put it in Android. So yeah, we've got a load of settings here. And actually, if you download the project, you can just copy our device profile settings that we did for this one. Physics, here we go. So for those of you who haven't seen Cropout before, it has these little characters. Zoom in. You've got these lovely little hats, and I don't know how well you can see it, but when they move around, the tops of the hats will jiggle based on kind of their physics movement, so you can kind of see that. And that's actually using like a physics constraint on it, right? And for higher end devices, we can afford to have jiggly hats on all of our little characters, but for mobile, that's potentially a step too far, right? So we want to disable that for our other platform. So for that reason, we actually just set the rigid body to 0. And what that will do is it just disables all rigid body, kind of physics sim and animation stuff on that particular platform. So yes, the console variables you can set on there. And actually, if you export on your phone a packaged build that's still in development mode, you can actually trigger a lot of those CVars directly on your phone as well. So if you want to see what a particular setting looks like, you can just do it. And also, this is a really good question because it's triggered a load of extra stuff that I wouldn't have necessarily done. You can also do, I think it's just, execute console command. You can actually specify console commands in here as well. So you can enable and disable and set quality distances on this and actually expose this to like a in-game like kind of dev UI. So you could go in and you could, it would allow you to really kind of tweak and modify those settings, and you'd be able to see it directly on the device as you were going. So it's a really nice way of like tweaking and editing those settings, especially if you're not 100% sure what they're doing or what performance gain you're getting from them. Because again, like a lot of this stuff can feel like you're just kind of like typing in values and not necessarily knowing 100% what that's going to do. So you can type those in on your device, and it will update, and then you can just carry on using it as you need.
Awesome.
So yeah, great question.
Yeah. Next question, and then I figure I can kind of keep the rest of these saved up in the meantime. But the last one for now is from Seaburn, and they're wondering, for those concerned about performance specifically on mobile, does mesh instancing work on mobile devices?
Yes, it does. So you can use instance static mesh components and spawn a bunch of instance meshes inside there. For Cropout, we didn't do that because actually all of our assets were blueprint actors because we needed to be able to chop them down and interact with them, and they needed to hold data. But if we hadn't done that, we could have absolutely used instances. Yeah, so if they were maybe a little bit more static and a little less prone to being chopped down by little villagers, you could 100%, and you should 100% use instancing wherever possible. Instancing is great for everything. The only thing to keep in mind with instancing is, again, depends per project, right? But so there's a few different types of instance inside our asset. So we have, I add this to randomly to show you. So if we do instance, so we have instanced, and then we have hierarchical instanced. For those of you who don't know the difference between the two, hierarchical instancing will basically let you have different LODs per distance on that group. So if you're in a forest, you're standing in the middle of that forest, and you're using hierarchical instance static meshes, then the trees closest to you will be the best LOD, and the trees furthest away will be the worst. If you use a regular instance static mesh, then it will be the same LOD for everything. Okay, so there is a cost associated with using hierarchical because you are paying for, kind of like more diversity on that instanced mesh, but generally you do want to use it if you have LODs and you are utilizing your LODs. If you're not utilizing LODs at all, if you never generated it, then you might as well just use instance static mesh because that's it. The other thing I will say as well is that if you instance your assets together, they will all be rendered. So if you again make a forest with trees and you have them all instanced, then if any of the trees are visible, if they are inside the visible frustrum, then they will render. Even if you can only see one tree, you are kind of like paying some of the cost of rendering all of that. And actually, you can see that there's a great console command called freeze rendering. I think you just type in that, and then it will come up in the top left, rendering frozen. And what that will do is that at the point that this is an awful map to demonstrate this because there is only this. But if you do this inside a scene that's maybe slightly more decorated and a little bit more used, then what this will do is it will snapshot from where your camera was at the time, but it won't update any of the frustrum culling, render culling, because obviously you can't see any of that because it all figures out where you are and you can't beat it, right? So it'll always show it. But freeze rendering lets you lock that in, and then you can see everything that's being rendered. So if you do that with an instance static mesh component, what you should see, again, if the rendering team have changed this now, they're going to make me look really stupid, but I don't think they have. But you should see that if you do this, then it will render, the whole thing will be visible still. With the caveat, again, I'm going to try and cover my backside now a little bit with this. For a long time from 5.0, freeze rendering didn't work with Nanite, so I can't quite remember if Nanite now supports freeze rendering. It may do. So if it doesn't, if you're looking at it and it's not working, it's Nanite, then that could just be because Nanite doesn't support freeze rendering. Because again, Nanite uses its own render path, so it's a little bit different. But yes, generally speaking, your instance stuff will be batched together. Now, the really nice thing about things like world partition and some of the other tools that we have is that while that is true that it will any instance group it will render, it will automatically actually segment those instances for you if you use world partition. So if you have a world partitioned map, which again is basically controls all of the streaming in and out based on distance for your open world, if you have set that up, then your instance static meshes, if you use the foliage painting anyway, will automatically get batched into the cells of that world partition. So if you have that grid, it will get kind of like batched into each one of those. So if you're going, he's a fool, and you've got a world partition scene, then that's probably why some of those trees are actually being culled, because they're actually a different instance that's just automatically handled for you.
Awesome. All right. I lied. I have
questions.
I have, which is good, honestly. Because it helps to cover any of the kind of like finer details that might be easily glossed over or missed. I do have one final question before I let you move on. I lied to you because this is important. Okay, this one's really important. Everyone, they need to know, if you're talking about optimization, is there a way to optimize the wobbling so that the wobbling can remain? Because it's a very important aspect of this.
If the wobbling is that critical to your game, you've got to find a way to afford it, right? Like that. Ultimately, that's it. So, if I don't think there are almost certainly some scalability settings that you can set on the physics quality. But actually what I would probably do is, if I couldn't afford the rigid body animation, what I would probably do is have a static mesh fallback with a vertex, like a world position offset animation on the fruit slash wobbliness on there instead. You can, as far as I think there is a skeletal baker that lets you, so I think it might be just as a plugin, but it might be a standard in the editor now. But there is something that lets you actually bake that stuff out to like a vertex animation texture. Alternatively, you probably want to just do it in like a world position offset on a static mesh, if it was really that important. But yeah,
it's the key feature.
There's definitely some settings that you could apply to like the physics system. I'm fairly sure the rigid body option is just it's either on or it's off. Unfortunately, there's not really a fine-grained detail between it, but there are definitely settings on your on your render on your physics system, which is what the rigid body is using. So on the rigid body node, it's either set to 0 or 1, but there are all of these settings that let you specify it. So what you would probably want to do, first turn it on and package it and see if it works. Because if it works, then hey, you've done it, it's fine, there's no problem. And then hope that no one in the tech department notices that you've turned on physics for your hats in your project. But yeah, otherwise there's a bunch of rigid body kind of settings that you could specify here. So you probably have to play around with those to try and bring the cost down. But we just kind of decided we're just going to turn it off for Android. But in fairness, if you've got it on your main character, there's a good chance you could afford it, and it would be it'd be absolutely fine. You can also set it on distance as well, so you could have it only work on characters that are really up close, and stuff like that. So there's definitely settings that you can apply on general physics items and on that. But yeah, it's about being careful with this stuff, right? So like a lot of the time when you're building a game, especially as an indie, and you're not necessarily building like the most intensive, kind of like massive game ever, because why would you? You're in a small team. You're kind of limited by that already. Actually, you tend to find that you don't run into these problems until potentially much later on. So yeah, it's just it's just worth keeping in mind when you're doing this stuff. But luckily, the device profiles and the CVar settings are really good for letting you kind of make those changes like very late on, and it not really being an issue. But yeah, the best advice I can give is just test early and test often, and test on your worst target device. That's kind of like the main thing.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I release you from this this particular section of questions, and I will save the rest for later. Okay,
cool. So the next thing I would like to talk about is reducing package load. This one's a really contentious topic, because whoops, I need to unfreeze. I think I can just type in unfreeze. Unfreeze rendering. Help me, chat. I can't remember what. I'm just going to type it in again and see if that gets rid of it. There we go. Okay, cool. Because that could have really messed me up if I hadn't done that. So kind of Unreal has a. What's the best word to describe it? It's got an association with mobile projects of having large package sizes. I think is probably the best way to describe it. And to many extents, that is true. One of the things that Unreal does is that it comes ready with lots and lots of stuff, right, that we think you will probably need. And because it comes with all of that extra stuff, a lot of that stuff gets packaged by default when you build out your game. So if you were to take the first-person blueprint or the third-person blueprint as an example, and you were to package that out to Android, it would probably be about 120 meg, I think. Cropout was a fair bit bigger. I think that was about 300 in the end. And again, like depending on the type of mobile game that you're targeting, it's could be seen as quite a considerable size. So there are ways that you can reduce that down, and they vary in complexity. The first thing that you can do, or the kind of like the easiest thing that you can do, is you can disable a ton of stuff. So where the engine comes pre-packaged with all of that content, we actually found that one of the big adders for us, because we actually procedurally generate this landscape here, so this little kind of thing is actually a dynamic static mesh that we procedurally build whenever the player starts a new game. When we enable to do this, we had to enable the geometry script tools and some of the geometry plugin. That actually added quite a bit on for us, which is why the package ended up being quite a bit bigger, because our actual asset size, I think, is about 70 meg total. So these plugins can potentially add quite a bit to your file size. So if you can, you should go through and you should disable any of the plugins that you don't need. Unfortunately, you need a lot of these plugins in order to build stuff, right? Like because there's stuff like nav mesh and AI support and stuff like that. And if you need AI, then unfortunately you need to leave these plugins enabled. But ultimately, right, like this stuff is just an associated cost. But there are a load of these plugins that are kind of built in. You can go through. And in fact, I think someone in the community actually did build like an automatic plugin detector that would like go through and go, you have all of these plugins installed and you don't necessarily need them, and they'll add this much. But I can't remember where that I can't remember where that is or if it's still maintained. It was quite a long time ago. But anyway, there's lots and lots of these plugins that you can do, and that will reduce down your package size. The other things are some of the stuff that I discussed earlier. So if you set your limits on your texture sizes, on your LODs, on your meshes, and some of your other settings, that will also reduce down your package size as well, because you're not packaging those 8K textures that you love so much. And then once you kind of reach that point, you kind of got all of your textures and your meshes and your assets down as much as you can. You've disabled as many of the plugins as you can. The next thing that you can do, if you really need to get your file size down more, is you can run a custom build of the engine, which sounds daunting, but actually is not that bad, right? Like it does, when you build a custom version of the engine, does mostly set it up itself. All you need to do is tell it to, you download it from Git, you generate it. If you're on a custom license, you download from Perforce, and then you generate the project files, you build it, and then you're good to go. But what you can do is, if you run a custom version of the engine, you can actually disable a load of stuff at the engine level as well. So there's a load of plugins and content and assets that you can actually just completely strip out. And now that is a much more involved version, because one of the nice things about Android development, and to some extent iOS development as well, is that you don't actually need to run a custom version of the engine to package out. So this is something that you need to do if you're doing console development, where you have a platform that is under some NDA restriction, like Switch or PlayStation or whatever. You would need to run a custom version of the engine and add the kind of like those platform specific files that you get from them. But with Android, you don't actually need that. All you need to do is install the correct SDK and NDK, and then you're pretty much good to go. I've made that sound very easy. It is quite involved, unfortunately, because there's a lot of specific like Android things you need to tick on the Android SDK and stuff like that. But once you've got them installed, you don't actually need to run a custom version of the engine. Just the one that you get from the launcher is absolutely fine to use, and you'll be able to do pretty much everything that you need to. But if you do want to reduce that package size down, then unfortunately you do need to go into the editor and start kind of like stripping some of that stuff out. So it is about kind of like pulling that content size down. Once you do that, though, you do get a greatly reduced size. But unfortunately, the default, you will end up with some excess that you may not necessarily need, but most people do need, right? Like that's the ultimate downside. There are some other things that you can do as well. So on your project settings, there's a few things that you can do. So I believe it's including editor content. So you can actually tell it to exclude your editor content when you package, and that can help remove some of the content that you've got in there. If you are using any of the editor content, though, that can cause some minor issues. If you've told it to exclude that content and then you are actually using it somewhere in the game, so that is something that you do need to keep in mind. You can also exclude certain like things like shader compilation levels and things like that if you want to. And then also, I believe this is in, I believe it's in packaging. We have, nope, not those. Where is it? Here we go. We have a thing which basically allows you to specify what assets you want to cook and what assets you don't want to cook. So by default, the editor will find all of the levels that you have inside your project, and any of the assets that are in those levels, it will have kind of like a reference chain, and it will package everything that's included. So if you've generated like, let's say you're building a game that's got lots of different levels in it, you're not necessarily ready to release 6 of those levels. If those levels are inside your project, they will be included and they will be packaged along with everything else. And this is going to kind of go into my next thing, which is long package times, which you can run into as well. But basically what you want to do is you want to specify specifically what assets you want the editor to cook and what you want it to exclude. So one of the things that we did with Cropout, so we added a directories to never cook and test directories to not search. We added a thing called packignore and icon baker. And what this does is it basically gives you a folder inside here that will be completely ignored by the packaging tool. So this is really, really nice if you're building stuff that you need to have in the project inside the editor, but you never want it to see the light of day in a project. So let's say you're building a trailer for your game and you have a specific level for that trailer which has its own sequence and you add some extra content and some stuff like that. That is a great place to put inside a folder that is specifically ignored by the packager. And you can take this even further. So when you're developing your packaging, so in your package settings, no, maybe I do want that. Is it Project Launcher? Maybe it's Project Launcher. You can create a custom profile, and that also lets you specify what assets you want to pack and what you want to ignore. So what I see, and this tends to be more of the kind of like the larger development studios who are working on mobile, especially ones with VR, that's another big one, is that they tend to package the entire game every time they package and they want to build out to test something. Whereas actually they're much better off creating a profile or letting the developer set up their own project settings to only package a very specific subset of the game so that they can test it. So if you are a character artist and you want to see your character set up, you can create a character preview level, put your characters in there, and then you can package out and just specify just that level. And it will only search within that level. So it'll only look at those characters and it'll only package those out. You can then preview those characters and look at them. You can do the same with levels and stuff like that, but you can strip out everything else. And what that means is that you are massively reducing the amount of data you're having to actually pack up and export out. And again, and test and stuff like that. So it's a really good idea if you are, again, starting to get to quite a large package size for your project, and you want to try and test stuff quickly and rapidly. It's a really good idea to just package that stuff down. If your game project is small, like Cropout's really small, then it tends not to be that much of an issue. You just need to make sure that you're restricting the content so that you're, all of this stuff. So we've got like a character test asset. We've got a few different levels. We have actually got a plugin as well that we strip out called Icon Baker, which we only use for building the textures for the UI. So you can strip that data out really easily, and that way you're kind of like reducing the amount of stuff that you're packaging up. And that's going to really help as well. On the topic of, kind of like stripping content out, one of the things that you may not know is that Unreal, again, tries to be as helpful as possible. It wants to make sure whenever you drop something into a scene or you use it in some way, that asset is ready to go and it can use that asset when that level is opened. And loads of other contexts as well. But what that means is that you will load in potentially a lot more data than you actually need. You could load in a lot more meshes, and as a result, you could load in a lot more textures and a lot more materials, and so on. So what we have inside the editor is a thing called the reference viewer. I'll do one of the blueprints because that tends to have some good references. So if we open up our reference viewer, this is our asset. And what the reference viewer does, and I'll just expand this out so we can see a bit more, is that it will show you, so this is our asset that we've chosen to view our references for. It will show you everything that references that asset or is loaded in when you load in that asset. So when I add the BP villager to the world, this is all the data that it will load in with it. It's quite a lot of data. And generally, we need some of this data. Yeah, generally we need some of this, right? So like in this instance, we've got like the pickaxe and the hoe, the hammer, basket. These are all the assets that the villager will use when they're doing a particular job. So we will need these at some point, but we don't necessarily need them every single time we drop the villager in. Same with all the hats, right? So because we reference the hats to the villager, that thing gets a connection. So all of their hats get that nice reference. Now what you'll hopefully notice is that a lot of these lines are pink and some of them are white. The pink lines means that it's a soft reference. So that means that you're not explicitly going to load that data in when you load that asset, which is a good way of working. We want pink lines for the most part. There's exceptions to that, obviously, but we want pink lines. The white lines are hard references. That means that whenever the villager is loaded in, this is always loaded with it. So whenever I load in the villager, I always load in my enum resource type asset. I always load in my game instance. I always load in my resource BPI, my standard macro library, all of this stuff. Well, not that, but all of this stuff up here. So what you should see is that we've got loads and loads of pink stuff, and that's because we've set up Cropout correctly, and we're using soft references as much as possible. Now we can filter those out, so we can go in and we can say, no, I can't remember where they put it. My brain, references, there we go. Show soft references, untick. So we have, once we kind of untick show soft references, you can see that this list gets much, much smaller and much more manageable. So now, when we load in, we have the crate, which is kind of like our starting asset. We have the skeletal mesh for our villager, and by extension, the materials for that. And by that extension, we have the textures for that as well. We have one hat, which again is kind of like our base hat asset. We have a shadow material, which we actually render as a decal underneath the villager. And we have some animations and like the animation blueprint, our hair reference, and our job table and stuff like that. So basically what that means is that whenever we load in, we're only loading in the stuff that we need, right? Like that's the kind of the premise, right? So with our level here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce down the load time between levels. So when I press new game and the game being visible and running, I want to make that time as short as possible because I don't want to leave people in a menu for ages. If you set up your asset references correctly, you can really, really reduce down the amount of stuff that needs to be loaded in first before that level can be shown. And that's kind of what we're doing here. So with our reference viewer, we're trying to load in as little as possible when we first start, when we first add a villager to the world and so on. We're trying to reduce that down as much as possible. And then when we need that thing, or when we know we're going to need that thing, then we can do what's called an async load. So on our villager, we've got a load of examples of how this is used. So we have our asset here. So whenever our job is changed, so whenever you kind of tell the villager to do a different job, we are going to get our data from a data table. And that data table has a reference to the job that they need to do, the behavior tree, the animation that they play when they're performing that job, the hat that they should wear, and the tool that they should use to perform that job. These are all soft referenced. So in our data table, all of these assets that we're referencing here are just soft reference. And then, so we get that data, we pull it, and you'll see that it's going to be a different node color as well, because when we create a variable that's soft reference, it will be a different color. Then what we do is we perform async loads. So that is basically, you can see it's got a timer on it. And that basically means that it's not going to happen immediately. It's going to trigger completed once it has loaded in that particular asset. So when we change our job, we tell it to async load our animation, our assets that we're going to use. And then once that async load is complete, then we trigger the job change. So what that means is that until that villager is told to do that job, we haven't loaded in any of that extra data. So again, what that eventually, and if you do that for enough stuff, what that eventually means is that you're actually staggering the content that you're loading in over a more extended period of time, rather than bulk loading it in all at the same time. So there's a few different ways that we're kind of tackling this package size and project size and referencing, right? Like we've got to tackle it from the point at which we package it out. And then we also have to tackle it from the point at which we load and open our levels. Now, some of that stuff is inevitable. Like you are going to need to load some stuff in when you open a level, right? Like in our instance for Cropout, that's very minimal. We have our water plane. We have some instant static meshes underneath that, just to give it a little bit of variety. And then we have our asset reference for our island. And you can see actually on our in our world outliner, we've not got a lot of assets in there, and that's actually just because we create the assets when we load in. So you can kind of stagger that content a lot depending on how you're building. Otherwise, if you are going to have a large amount of content, then you are going to have to just bite the bullet on it. But either way, it's worth doing, because ultimately you do only have like a fixed budget for memory for stuff that you can load in, especially on these lower end platforms. And you need to be really mindful of that, because if you're loading in a load of extra data you don't actually need, just because it's got a hard reference somewhere, it's got a hard reference somewhere, that's got a hard reference, that's got another hard reference to a load of other stuff, and you could be loading a lot of stuff in unintentionally. A really good example I've got is for a loading screen someone built, which was me when I was building a game back when I was doing kind of one of my first games. So originally I had like a nice big, got a loading screen, so a nice big kind of like piece of artwork that came up when it dropped a loading screen. So you had something to look at, and then it displayed a little tooltip text at the bottom to kind of like tell you how to do it. So to do that, I made an array of textures in my loading screen, and I put like 30 1920 by 1080 textures that I could randomly pick when you opened up the loading screen, right? Not knowing about referencing and all of that stuff at the time, because I was, I kind of just started out on in UE4. So what I didn't realize was when I was putting that array of textures in, I was loading in every single texture into memory, even though I was only showing one on screen. So actually what I should have done was I should have had an array of soft texture references that was my reference to my texture list, and then I should have loaded in the texture that I needed and then displayed that one, rather than loading in every single texture. So if you're not careful with this stuff, you can really, really easily blow out your memory budget on textures and meshes and assets and blueprints and all sorts of stuff that you're not even using. Another example is if you build a blueprint, which lots of people do. They build like a blueprint that's kind of more of a tool that they use to spawn assets into the world, or spawn, kind of like content in. Let's say that you want to scatter a load of stuff into the world. If you preload all of the meshes that you think you might possibly need into that blueprint, guess what? You're loading in every single one of those meshes. Even if you only use 2 or 3 of them, if you've put like 100 meshes into like a list of potential meshes it can use, you've loaded in every single one. And even if the final output of that is only those 3 meshes, if you've got that blueprint in your level, then you've loaded in every single one of them. So it's really important when you're doing this stuff to restrict the assets that you're referencing. So either keep them as a soft reference or make it an empty array that you can drop in and then make sure it uses every single asset that you put into that array. And yeah, that will hopefully reduce that stuff down for you. Right. Shall we do some more questions?
Sure.
How are we doing for time?
And, we're doing great. We've got plenty of time left. We're looking good. There's a lot of good things to kind of keep in consideration with some of those last bits too, especially the as soon as you were mentioning having like the 30 different textures that could get pulled up, I was like, I see where this is going.
That's why wouldn't you? You need the textures. You just need to pick one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You don't realize you've loaded every single one into memory.
It's fine. You live and you learn, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I did. Eventually.
And then we have all learned through that experience. So thank you for taking the spear for us on that one. There's another question here about soft references, actually, where they're wondering, are soft references automatically released?
The soft reference doesn't need to be released. It'll be the hard reference that are released. So the soft references will always be there, but they aren't specifically loading in. They're just kind of like more of a pointer to a specific thing. But the hard reference will be released. So once you remove it, it should automatically get picked up by the garbage collection and eventually get filtered out. It might not happen straight away, but it will kind of like get filtered out eventually. If there's no more things that need that asset, it will go.
Awesome. Let's see. I had another question that I nabbed about packaging, and now I can't find it. No.
Yeah, there's a massive amount on packaging. You can go down a very, very large rabbit hole on packaging.
Yeah, it feels like that, especially for mobile, is maybe almost more. Well, maybe I shouldn't say more. I should be careful how I phrase this, but it feels like it's just as important as the just optimization as just how you package it and how it's able to get presented to the tech that it's aimed for. Yeah,
absolutely. Because I mean, for one of the biggest reasons is just because it's a different input method that you can't nicely replicate on the device that on your PC or on your Mac. You can you can emulate it, you can fake it, but it's not a very trustworthy source. Generally, the best thing to do is always to package it out and do it. So you will be doing a lot more packaging, just by its very nature, onto mobile devices. When I did Cropout, I had I think it was 4 Android phones that I picked. So I had the Google Pixel 4a, Pixel 7 Pro. I also got a foldable as well, mainly because I was like, I do not know what's going to happen on a foldable, because there's so many because there's there's the 2 screens, and then there's the aspect ratio is very different to any other device and stuff like that. So I did that, and then I think I had another a more of a mid-range device, but I was building out to every single one of them, kind of as I was going. I was reasonable because I'm cheating because I've done this stuff before anyway, right? So I know the general device profiles to put in, so I could just load them in and then do it, and then it kind of just ran fine. But the device profiles thing is massive, right? Like you will get a significant performance difference just by changing device profile settings. So if you've got like a good list of device profiles to work from to set that stuff up, then you're already, kind of like most of the way there. Then it's all about just doing kind of like minor tweaks and changes. Again, depending on the type of game you're building.
Right, yeah. For input method, there was a question from Tide Moore, and they were wondering how hard is it to generalize input methods across mobile and other input methods?
It's a good question. So I think trying to think now, because it is really, you do have to really think about how your game's input is going to work, right? Like it was a really big point of contention with Cropout when we were trying to figure out, because we had to make it work for gamepad and for keyboard and mouse and for touch. And for mouse and touch, there's a lot of parallels which work really nicely. The gamepad and keyboard don't necessarily work well together. The other thing that we tested as well, I don't think I have it on me, but I've got it around my office somewhere, is that there's a lot of ways of playing kind of like with a gamepad or a gamepad-like device on your phone. So even if you're doing it for mobile, you generally do need to kind of think about how people are going to interact with the game at a kind of at a gamepad level as well. Whether they're using like a Razer, it's a Kishi, or a backbone controller, or even just connecting like with a PlayStation controller or an Xbox controller to their phone, which you can do as well. One of the nice things about the engine is that all of the input controls are tied together. So generally you can kind of like just set them up once for each of them and then process them the same way. We found that that worked for the most part for what we built, but there were some small exceptions that didn't quite fit. So in core player input. So this is our input profile. Again, if you haven't used Unreal in a while, then this might be new to you because we've actually moved away from having our input set up in our project settings. This was it before, where you would kind of set up all of your inputs, and then each of those inputs would have like the attribute added to them. This has been extended with a thing called enhanced input, where now the assets are actually held inside the content browser. And it's really cool. You can set up loads of different profiles and then you can load in, switch between the two. It's brilliant for accessibility because you can actually set up whole different rules and input like groups and sets without, and then switch between them with very little work. But for stuff like this, right, we had, let's say, zoom. So zoom was quite a nice, easy one. We just set that to be a one-dimensional axis. So positive and a negative for this particular one on a gradient. And then inside our base input and mappings, we have zoom. And then we just specify how we want the input to be on that. So for touch, we actually use a predefined pinch, which is a gesture control that comes kind of pre-built with the engine. So you can use pinch, flick, and rotate. So we just use pinch, and then we use the wheel axis for the mouse, and then for the gamepad, we use the right analog stick y-axis. And then one of the other nice things about enhanced input is that you can then modify the raw input that comes in. So on our gamepad, all we need to do is set up a bit of a dead zone on our gamepad, so it doesn't necessarily trigger straight away. On our wheel axis, we can do a negate, which I believe just inverted the actual input for the scroll wheel. And then on our pinch, we added multiple. So we had a dead zone, we had a negate, but then I also actually built my own input modifier. which was inside Blueprint. So I am offset. And what that does is it takes the raw input and then it adds a value to it, because I found that actually the value coming in on the pinch would never go to negative. It was always a between like 0 and up. So actually what I found was that in order to get it to work right, I had to offset it so that pinch would go into the negative value to give me parity between the mouse, the gamepad, and the mobile touch. So basically using this setup, you can get your inputs to parity across every single one of the platforms that you're targeting, or I should say all of the different input methods that you're targeting, right? Because we can't guarantee the input method that they're using just based on the platform that they're using. So we did that for all of them. So we have our gamepad keys, and then we have our gamepad keys for move. You'll notice that there's no touch input for there or mouse input, and that's because we actually needed to implement a new method for handling mouse and touch, because this is quite contextual to the type of game that we were building. But with an RTS, you often have the expectation that you can click and drag the screen, so you can kind of like click down in a space and then you can pull it, and it will kind of like pull the game world around with you. So that's very different to using just like the gamepad, right, where I'm just kind of like using the keys to just kind of like move around. And we wanted to copy that for touch. So actually we have an additional input, which is where it got a little bit more complicated. Just because of this particular type of game, we actually added another input mapping context called drag move, which would be initiated based on when the mouse or the touch input was detected. So we have touch and mouse there, and then we could use that to kind of like pull and define the information that we had. But yeah, that was it for input. It is, kind of like definitely one of the easiest parts of the engine is are our input settings. I think they work really nicely. The way that you can kind of just batch that input together, and the enhanced input stuff has got much more complexity to the stuff that I'm going into in this session. You can add triggers, you can add modifiers, you can set it so that it requires a series of buttons to be pressed in order to activate. So you can get seriously complex input requirements for stuff to trigger. But kind of for me, I just needed buttons, so I just added them as buttons, and that was pretty much it.
Simple enough. Yeah, absolutely. I think, all right, I've got a couple more questions that I'll keep in my back pocket for the very end, just in case, because I think there was one more topic you wanted to touch upon, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the last thing is our final package and build. So again, I'm going to try and do this on the phone as well, just to show some of this stuff, and we'll see how that works because I've got it on here. And I'm going to turn my volume off on as well, just in case. So setup for an actual Android device. We do have some decent documentation on setting up your project. So on our website, we have the Android Quick Start Guide, which takes you through all of the setups that you need to do. Basically, all you need to do is on your Android device of choice, you need to make sure that you're in developer mode. You generally do that by pressing some number of times on some specific thing in the device settings. But if you search for your phone and how to go into developer mode, it will come up and it will tell you, so you can do it on that. And then on your development device, so your PC or your Mac, you need to download some software. So by default, this is not going to be set up and ready. You do need to install this yourself and get it ready. But once you've done that, it's pretty easy to do. So just go to development requirements. Okay. So we have a list of basically the hardware that you need based on the platform you're using. From 427, I think onwards, it's predefined as a single set requirement. And then we also have a load of settings as well on. There it is. That's what I want to go on. SDK and NDK. So basically, you just need to get the SDK and the NDK set up on your device. I've already got it set up on this PC because I do Android development, so I can't really take you through it because it's already there. But this guide will take you through it. Basically, you download Android Studio 4.0, you run through the settings. Ideally, you want to leave the install locations as default because Unreal will automatically search that route. So if you've left it as default, then you have less work to do. If you change the directory where it installs stuff, then you will have to go in and manually specify where you want that to go. So once you've done that and you've got Android Studio installed, you just need to install a few specific SDKs, a few specific files. You run the setup for Android, then you need to restart your computer. And yeah, again, all of this stuff is in here. It is tedious and sometimes it doesn't work for seemingly no reason on the Android install setup. But you do just need to persevere with it. Just make sure that you're installing the SDK version that it's asking for, and all of that stuff, and you should be fine. And then once you've got that set up and installed, you'll get the Android package set up and ready to go. So we've been through most of the package setup stuff already. The only thing I did want to go into is inside our project settings. Once you've got the Android system set up, you will get the Android listed on the platforms. I think actually this might be listed anyway. It just won't necessarily work. This will be red where it doesn't have the SDK linked. So once you've got that all set up, you can then create your game inside Android Studio, which again you'll need to. I won't go into in this because that's their dev environment, not ours. So they've got reasonable documentation on that stuff as well. So you should be able to add your own project, and then you can add all of that information into here. One of the really nice things about Unreal for mobile is that it has the most exposed stuff to Blueprint of any of the other platforms. So in terms of because the environments for Android and iOS are already defined and set up and ready. Adding things like leaderboards, in-app purchases, advertising, like user account setup and authorization is all like ready out of the box, right? So Cropout has it all, has a load of this stuff prepackaged in. We even added in an in-app purchase to the menu that only shows up when you play it. So if we do that one, I'm going to try and show it. You can see that there's actually 4 options. There's a bottom one, make a donation. It doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. It's not linked. It's not linked to anything, so don't worry about accidentally sending some random person a load of money on that stuff. It doesn't actually do anything. But the Blueprint side of things is set up and ready. So if we go to, I think it's inside the main menu, and go inside a graph, we can check to see if an in-app purchase has been made, again, all inside Blueprint, and we have like a success and failure state, and then we can trigger an in-app purchase as well, so you can make an in-app purchase. Now, the in-app purchase setup stuff has to be done on Android Studio side, so you have to define that stuff. But then once it's defined, all you need to do is add it in here and in your project settings, and then you're good to go. So again, you don't need a custom build of the engine to get that running. It will just work. Same with achievements and leaderboards, all of that stuff. Once you've set it up on the Android Studio side, you can set it up in here as well, and it will all get transferred across. So we have an achievement map and a leaderboard map. So you just add those in, and it's really very easy to get set up and working. Same with your icons as well. You can add your icons here, add your background launch wallpapers and stuff to there as well. And then we've got loads of other like kind of default settings that you can do on all of your settings. So you've got some cook settings, you've got your audio settings as well. And if we go up, there is a package settings as well. So you can kind of like force different OBB files. You can specify how you're going to export it. You can choose how it's going to orient the screen. So whether it uses sensor or whether you're going to restrict it to a particular aspect ratio and angle. And yeah, that's pretty much it. There's loads of other settings in here. I don't think we're going to have time to go into all of those. Some of them are very involved. So you can do stuff like define what gets packaged into groups. So you can have you can basically force it so it downloads a very small initial package for the project, which is really useful for mobile, so that you can have a very small initial package, but then you can have kind of like extra that needs to download after that as well. So if you've played any large-ish game on Android or iOS, then you'll have experienced this, where you download the app downloads in a very short period of time. You open it up and then it goes, haha, I need to download some stuff. And then it starts downloading like gigs of extra data. So you can set that all up in here as well. So you can kind of specify how that gets packaged out. But the platform settings for this are very deep. And again, you can kind of specify what you discard on Cook and what you keep. And you have some optimization settings here as well. And finally, before I run out of my voice stops working, on the rendering side, you can also specify. My brain stopped working. Rendering. There it is. You can also specify some mobile-specific render quality settings as well. So by default, Unreal uses deferred shading. As of 5, I think it was into 5.1. Or maybe 5.2, but actually deferred rendering kind of became like an acceptable default for mobile. So you can use deferred rendering for mobile now. I think it's still got a bit more to go, but it's really good. I mean, we used it for Cropout. We ended up using deferred rendering for mobile, and we had no performance issues with that. But I do think forward is still quicker. But it has more limitations in terms of like what you can do. You'll lose access to stuff like post-process materials, some decal settings, and a few other things like that. So you generally get kind of like a frame rate boost from using forward, but you lose some other stuff. And then you've got some other ones as well. So your anti-aliasing solution and whether you allow certain things or not. So you can set those on there, and that will kind of help again with all of the stuff that we've kind of discussed. So performance, package size, things like that. And that's it.
Awesome. That's it. Just a huge rundown through all of these. First of all, I'm amazed that you can actually remember where all of these settings are just easily off the top of your head, without having it written down somewhere or with some kind of reference. Do you want to see my notes as well? These are my notes. It's just
I'm scared.
It's just basically to just try and keep me on track. Oh, I didn't get rid of them in time. Oh, well, it's fine. Yeah.
That's all right. Yeah, it's crazy being able to just have all of that available in your brain. I don't get it, but I appreciate it.
I've deleted a lot of other stuff out of there to make room for it. There's a lot of things I can't remember that just to make room for CVar settings and stuff.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have just a couple more questions for you, and then I figure we can kind of wrap it up there. Feels like a nice little bow to wrap it up with some questions at the end.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I'm pulling up the right list here. So one of the questions that did come up a couple times is they're wondering if most of this was written in Blueprint or if it was custom code as well.
So Cropout is 100% Blueprint, and you can build your entire game in Blueprint depending on the kind of game you're building. So there's a lot of stuff exposed to Blueprint that you can use. There's some stuff that gets tossed around with Blueprint performance-wise, where people say that it's it's C++ is more performant than Blueprint. That is true, but it's really, really minor. We had like a graph a little while ago to try and show it that when we're talking about like the performance difference, a lot of the stuff is like really negligible. So for generally for any event-driven logic, that's stuff that's not running continuously, not stuff that's running on tick. Any event-driven logic, any triggered logic is absolutely fine to run on a Blueprint and will be imperceptible differences with that and C++. The only time where moving Blueprint stuff over to C++ is advisable is when you're doing a lot of intensive stuff on the on tick, and even then you can still get away with doing a fair amount of stuff on tick, and it's absolutely fine. Kind of some of the stuff that I've worked on kind of before joining Epic, we had hundreds and hundreds of characters on screen running all their logic on event tick. And it ran like 120 FPS, right? Like, so there's a big, where the difference comes is between running an editor and running in a packaged like shipping build, right? So that does create differences. So when you package out, you should test you should test it as a packaged item, which you'd have to anyway for mobile devices, but also test it comparing shipped as well. But generally, you should feel absolutely comfortable using Blueprint for as much as possible. Blueprint is great. I am a massive, massive proponent of Blueprint. And it generally means that more people can work on the project, right? If you restrict stuff to C++, then you take away the opportunity for other people within your team to build good content. Generally, what we advise is that you actually just make sure that the people who are using Blueprint are taught good code practice. So that tends to be where Blueprint gets a bad rap, right? Because it's so much more accessible, so much more usable, that people who are much less experienced will build stuff with it. And they don't necessarily know the right way or a good way to build things. So they tend to build things that are very poor performance-wise. So it tends to get a bad rap from that, just purely from that. But actually, if you're sticking to good code practice, if you're keeping performant, if you're sticking to event-driven logic for that. Again, if you're using soft references, if you're using event dispatchers, and kind of like you're using all of the stuff that's available to you, then you'll be absolutely fine to use Blueprint, and you can absolutely ship on any platform that Unreal supports with a Blueprint-only project. And I did it, right? Like my game that I released before joining Epic was in 4.12, I think, and I released that on the PlayStation with no code. It was just, there were one or two INI files where I had to list the achievements or the trophies for it, and that was it. So yeah, you can 100% do it all in Blueprint, and you should do as much of it in Blueprint as possible to keep it open. Just keep in mind that the C++ side of things should be used. for any intensive work so that you can optimize it further. But again, if you build your C++ badly, you'll have just as many problems. So also keep
Yeah. Problems persist across both methods here for sure. I feel like you mostly answered this, but I'll kind of just follow up with this anyway. So a kind of question in the same realm was if someone has a extremely tight budget for their mobile game, or either like they're at the very end of it and they're just needing to get things cropped down as much as possible in this end run here. Do you think it's worth trying to convert blueprints that they have done over into C++, or do you think that the difference would be minuscule enough that there's probably other avenues to try and optimize from?
Yeah, it's so contextual. It's really hard to tell. If you've got some really, kind of expensive blueprints in there, then you will be able to see very quickly that that's the problem. So what I'd recommend is that actually you're much better off profiling your game and figuring out where those problems are. Right, so as well as stat FPS, which is the nice kind of default one, you also have stat unit. And stat unit, this is I picked the wrong color background to show this. I'm going to try. I've got nothing else. It's all blue. But so at the top we've got our frame rate, and then we have our frame budget, our game budget, our draw, our RHIT, our GPU time, and our draws. So each of these can be expanded upon to give us more information. So if we do, I think it's like stat game, that will tell you where your cost is. And this tends to be where you will see your blueprint costs coming in. So you've got the thing like tick time, world tick time, blueprint time, all of those elements. If you've got some really blueprint intensive elements, you will probably see that that's where the problem is. In fact, you'd probably see on your game thread that would be really high, and it would be kind of going orange to red color rather than the lovely green color that I have throughout because I built my game correctly. Not to brag. But so for each of these, we can kind of see where that performance is coming from. We can even do, so if we do like a profile GPU, we can see the cost associated with all of these things. Again, just keep in mind that we are previewing this from the PC perspective, not from the mobile perspective. So you can run some of these profiles on the mobile device. So things like stat FPS and stat unit will work on a packaged build that's set to development or debug, but you won't be able to open up the GPU visualizer inside your on your Android device, unfortunately. But all of this you can kind of see because expensive is generally expensive, kind of like wherever you're going, right? So you'll be able to see the stuff that's sticking out, I think is probably the core stuff. So you'll see the blueprints that are costing you, if they are costing you. If there's no issue on that side, then actually you're much better off profiling from the other side. So going, okay, well, what is costing me a lot? Kind of is it my GPU time? Is it my frame time? And at that point, you need to be looking at other areas to optimize your game, because converting stuff over to blueprint can be negligible depending on what you're doing. But yes, it is a very contextual. It's a very contextual question that very much does depend on the type of game you've built and how well you've built those blueprints.
All right, let's see. Next question I have is from Not the Tech Guy, who is wondering, as someone with no mobile development experience, would it be feasible to limit the simulation to the closest viewable character to help keep performance up? I'd imagine you'd want some sort of system for transitions between characters as the camera moves.
Yes. So you can, let's say on our villager, you can check. Let's see if I can remember this now. Render. No, is being rendered. No, rendered. Was actor recently rendered? So you can check to see whether the actor that you're looking at has been rendered recently. And one of the things that you could do is you can say, was my actor rendered in the last second? And if it wasn't, then you could say set your tick interval on your actor to be every. Don't actually set it to 1 because that would just be it would be horrendous. But you can reduce down the tick interval of the blueprints that aren't being that haven't been rendered recently. So if you've got like a load of actors on scene and they're all walking around but they haven't been rendered in a while, then you do this. That's one of the nice things about mass, the new kind of like large numbers of entities system. That's got tons of stuff built in that will kind of automatically manage the cost and strength of stuff like this. If you haven't seen that, you should check out some of the Matrix demo videos where they showed off how all of the simulations for the characters and the vehicles in that world are scaled based on how far away from the camera they are and a bunch of other properties and stuff like that. So nice thing about mass as well is that a load of that stuff has been exposed to Blueprint now, so that's much more kind of user friendly. I actually do plan to move Cropout over to mass once it's we've got the Blueprint support for it in place. But yes, you can check whether something's rendered and then change how that actor behaves based on that logic. The only thing that I would just be careful with is you because we're checking, you have to decide how often you're checking this. If you set like a timer up for the actor, like when it's not being rendered anymore, that check interval could mean that the actor is suddenly on the screen, but that interval hasn't been checked yet. So you would get a pop in where that character's like, oh, I am being rendered now. I need to update my tick to be more consistent. And then there's other stuff as well. So you do need to just like kind of keep in mind the stuff that's being impacted by you changing variables when it's not being rendered, and the fact that it's going to be very hard for you to know that thing is going to be rendered beforehand, right? Because this value will change from true to false, kind of like just like that, but you're not necessarily checking that often. So you just keep that in mind.
Yeah, awesome. A follow-up to that just popped up in chat is they're wondering if that would only change the event tick or the whole blueprint would update.
Well, you can change it to be anything because it would just be a function that exists within the blueprint. So the actor tick interval is one example, but you could set a bunch of other stuff as well. Just keep in mind that actually a lot of this stuff is handled automatically for you. So the skeletal mesh is a good example where I've got to try and remember where this one is. It will disable a lot of stuff automatically for you based on whether it's being rendered or not. So I think I've got to try and remember this now. See, now you've said that I can just remember all of this stuff. It's all gone out of my brain. I'm fairly sure, I'm trying to remember where it is, but you can, I swear you could set it to basically so many different options in this stuff.
I cursed you. I'm so sorry.
I'm bothered to set this. Visibility based anim tick option. Here it is. So you can tell the pose to not tick if it's not visible. So again, a lot of this stuff you only really want to change it a lot of the time for like aesthetic things and for things that kind of like you can control. But you've got to remember that when stuff's outside of the view frustum, it's not necessarily being rendered. So the kind of like the visual components will all kind of automatically not get rendered anyway. So same with this skeletal mesh, right? It will, in this instance, it will always tick pose and refresh bones, but you can tell it to only tick pose when it's being rendered as well. So there's a lot of settings kind of like out of the box that you can set on the asset to change for you, but you can also just do it yourself as well as extra. I would just say, just when you're doing that, just double check on the asset whether it has got any settings that you can apply to it. Kind of everything has every asset has a cull mesh has a cull setting that you can set on it, so you can set cull distances and stuff like that, so that the mesh doesn't get rendered at certain distances and other properties like that. So I just keep that in mind.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, I think the final question that I have for you then today is just going to be a slightly more general one of, do you have any kind of last overall advice that you would like to give to anyone who's looking into potentially developing for mobile using the engine? Any sage advice, words of wisdom?
I think the best piece of advice I can give is to get set up straight away and start packaging and building out for the target device. You cannot start that side of things early enough. Get your pipeline set up and working, get it packaging out, and then make sure that you're testing everything against that, especially if you are doing mobile only development. But the same is true for cross-platform. The number of people who are like, oh yeah, we're building our game at the moment, we think we're going to do Switch as well. You're like, are you testing for Switch? And they're like, no. And I'm like, you need to start testing for Switch, because there's some big implications of it. And actually, kind of if the platforms that you're releasing onto are high enough priority, then sometimes your game needs to change in order to accommodate those platforms. You can't do necessarily absolutely everything you want to do on a mobile that you could do on a PS5, right? And that's just a limitation of the hardware, right? Like, you are working against very different technological limits on that side. So while there's a lot you can do in terms of like profiling and scalability and all of that stuff, like if your game depends on 1,000 enemies on screen at any one time, and they always need to be rendering, they always need to be, kind of like, they're doing like kind of like flocking, or they're doing some, they're doing like weird like tracking of all the other like people around them. Like, you are going to have a really hard time getting that working on a low-end Android device if you can do it at all. So you just need to keep like that thing in mind. And if you are packaging straight away on your target, again, like, it shouldn't just be like my fancy super high fidelity kind of phone. It should be your lowest target device. And if you look at the distribution of mobile phones that are in circulation and that are actively used, the average device is really low spec, right? Like, I think it was similar for Steam as well. Like the average user device for like a GPU is really low spec. And if you are not making sure you're accounting for that spec, you're going to suffer for like in terms of sales, because you're limiting the number of people who can download the product. So yeah, get on that device as early as possible, start testing against it, and then pick kind of where you're going to go and test against that specific kind of level of quality of device. And ideally, especially if it's Android, test on a few, because there's so many Android devices out there, such a broad range of hardware, that you do really need to kind of be checking against kind of a few different types. So that's my main piece of advice for mobile development.
Yeah, which is fantastic advice, if I might say so myself. I think there's some real value in being able to actually test things where it's intended to end up, right? It feels like, that it sounds like the logical conclusion, but I think it's really easy to get caught up just in development and to get really focused on how something is working on the computer that you're building it on versus, you know, the end result there until you're kind of at the end of the line and you're like, oh no, so much needs to change now. So, very good.
And the same is true for publishers as well, right? Because you can get publishers who are like, yeah, no, we definitely want to get this game. We're going to get it on, you know, kind of like we get it on Xbox and PlayStation 5 and maybe Switch. And it's like no. let's not maybe. Let's decide that. You know, let's decide that now. So really try and, you know, like it's for mobile, but it's for everything. You know, kind of like figure out what your lowest platform is going to be, and then make sure you're testing against it. It's the main thing.
Yep, definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about this. This is really valuable extra information. I think, like I said, kind of at the beginning of the stream, I feel like we don't actually talk about like low spec development for Unreal Engine very often. So being able to do that and kind of dive into optimization and packaging is very helpful. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Always happy to come on.
Yeah. And then, of course, thank you everybody who came to watch. The show wouldn't be what it is without you and your participation and your questions. If you did ask a question and we didn't get a chance to answer it today, I do want to let you know that tomorrow, Friday at 12 p.m. EST, in the Discord channel Unreal Slackers, we are actually going to be having some open office hours where we're going to have on some of our own developers, some of our own team who are going to be answering questions that you might have just about the engine. So if you have anything about mobile specifically, or really any other part of the engine, feel free to hop in there, chat, ask questions. They're great, wonderful, have so much knowledge available in their heads collectively. It's a little scary to think about. I mean, you saw what Aaron was able to do today just on his own, so then take that and multiply it by however much. It's so much available. So if you haven't joined that server, go ahead and go do that and go hang out tomorrow. It's going to be a good time. You'll get to learn a lot of information. Then, of course, if you haven't already, go download Cropout, play around with it. There's so much good stuff in there. There was so much hard work and love and time and effort put into that project sample. So download it, play around with it, give some feedback, let us know what you think. It's really incredible work that was done on that. So I hope you download and enjoy and have a good time. And then last but certainly not least, today is the last day of the Epic Mega Jam. So no, I didn't forget about it. And yes, this is my reminder to you that if you're participating, make sure you get everything done, because turn-in is, let me pull up the official timer here so I can go down to the seconds. The submission is due in 7 hours, 55 minutes, and 20 seconds as of right now. So make sure you get everything finished and submitted by that time if you're participating. Very excited to see what everybody put together for this year. And yeah, hope y'all have been enjoying that process, because I'm excited to see what has come from it. But one last big thank you to Aaron for coming on today. Always such a pleasure to have you on here, and really excited to see where people go with mobile and the engine as well. I'm really excited to see that avenue kind of explored and expanded upon. But with that, we'll see all the rest of y'all next week for next week's Inside Unreal. Bye, everyone.